Thank you for joining me today for another episode of Hunger Hunt Feast. Today, I want to share with you some of the evidence I've seen linking uh, the polyunsaturated oils that are so prevalent in our current diet today with metabolic disease, and specifically heart disease, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. And while there's these are known as seed oils, or known, PUFA oils, omega-6 oils, it is specifically the fatty acid, linoleic acid, which is the primary omega-6 fatty acid in, in our diet, whatever fat you're looking at, it's present, but its percentage of concentration in these fats is much higher in the PUFAs, in the polyunsaturated fats, than it is in monounsaturated, and especially the saturated fats. And there's plenty of evidence showing that linoleic acid really is the driver of many diseases, especially metabolic disease, which I'm going to focus on today. There's plenty to show that it drives many other diseases like cancer, or can drive low testosterone. There's several. I don't want to go down all the bunny trails, let me put it that way. And I like to keep this kind of snappy. I like to keep it hopefully as a resource, because I'm going to link to all of these articles. So I'm going to move through them quickly, so it's not a boring, drudging, I'm reading through these studies kind of podcast. That's the last thing I want. But you can get the highlights of it and have this, as I said, I'm going to link to all of these, as well as have some charts in there that show some correlation between the increase of disease in the US, of metabolic disease, and the increased presence of these oils, specifically linoleic acid, in our diet. And yes, there's some correlation, as well as some controlled trials where there's actually changes in diet and observation done to show the evidence of this, as well as the increased concentration of these oils in our body fat. So, we don't create this fat, right? I don't want to get too far down the road here. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I want to start off quickly saying that I have previously, so go back easily 4 or 5 years ago, thought that increased sugar intake, was the primary driver of our current disease state, metabolic disease. And looking closer at the evidence of the last few years, I thought, oils certainly played a role in disease and were certainly bad for us. I understood that, as an oxidative stressor, because they're more easily oxidized, being unsaturated than saturated fat would be. Now, looking at some of what I'm about to show you, I would tend to believe that the presence of these oils, the increased intake of these oils, is the primary driver of metabolic disease. And increased intake of sugar, especially within the processed foods where these oils reside, but just increase of sugar, so sodas, candy, so forth, would certainly exaggerate metabolic disease, would drive it further, and certainly would need to be managed and ideally eliminated in order to reverse metabolic disease. We'll get into it, but I'm definitely shifted my emphasis in my personal emphasis in where the metabolic disease took off. What drove the takeoff of metabolic disease, better way of saying it, in our Western culture. And it was these oils, rather than sugar, that really impaired our metabolism, impaired our health, to the point that we could not handle the sugar. Yes, we're eating less wheat and more sugar. We were eating probably 50, 65-ish% less wheat than we used to, say 120 years ago, say late 1800s, late 1800s. and eating twice as much sugar easily, if not more. But these oils were non-existent. Well, the oils were non-existent. Okay. The fatty acid, linoleic acid, which is the primary driver of this disease, the increased concentration of that was very minimal in our diet 120 years ago. And we can't create linoleic acid in our system. We have to eat it for it to be present. And that's what we're going to look a little closer at right now. So just dive right in. So I'm going to include in the show notes all these links and a couple links to charts for you to look at, as well as you can see the concentrations in this first chart, for instance, of linoleic acid in a variety of oils. Now, they're not all there that you might like to see, and if you need, or you can always look at, I'll rattle them off here, but you can look at, they'll be in some in the show notes, but you can look up any of these you want to just with a simple Google search. It's real easy to find. But linoleic acid is far more present, as I said, in these polyunsaturated fats than it is in monounsaturated and saturated fats by a long shot. Canola oil, one of the most common, right? It is, there's like 21% is linoleic acid. Soybean oil, probably the most prevalent one used in restaurants, 54%, give or take, linoleic acid. Okay, corn oil, 57%, another bad one. Sunflower oil is like 71%. So if you're familiar with the Hateful Eight that Kate Shanahan, I think, made famous in her Fat Burn Fix and Deep Nutrition books, these are some of those. There's also grapeseed oil, rice bran oil, cottonseed, corn, I mentioned, soybean, sunflower, safflower, canola. I mean, they are the highest linoleic acid, not to leave out peanut oil, 32-ish, 33-ish% linoleic acid. So those of you who are frying your turkey in that, you're really changing the fat profile of that turkey. Turkey just went from, I mean, as if, yes, adding fat, oh, not a big deal. Peanut oil is supposed to be somewhat healthy. It's high in linoleic acid. If you're trying to avoid linoleic acid, which you might want to more so after this podcast, after hearing what I'm about to share, you probably don't want to go with peanut oil either. Olive oil, that was always a question I get. Olive oil and avocado oil. Avocado oil is about 12% linoleic acid. Olive oil is 9%, as opposed to something like coconut oil, which is like 2 or 3% linoleic acid. Lard is 9%. Butter, 3% linoleic acid. Tallow, 3% linoleic acid. So, and traditional, so the safflower oil, when you start looking these up, safflower oil might say it's lower, like 12, 13, 14%. That, or it might, right in there, but that's a modified safflower oil. So there's a safflower oil that's been modified to be higher in oleic acid, which is omega-9, like avocado oil. True, like original safflower oil that has been messed with is 76% linoleic acid. So that's why it's on the list of the Hateful Eight, because traditional safflower oil is very high in linoleic acid. The modified stuff, I mean, if you want to mess with that, that's on you. It's still 14%, even though it's had some omega-9 oleic acid added to it, or it's been modified to have more of that kind of fat in there. 14 is still a little high, as far as I'm concerned. I would probably venture away from something that's much over 10 or 11. And if you go to stick to single-digit fat that has single-digit linoleic acid, you're much better off, especially for the majority of the time. So this is what we're talking about here. Because across the board, say coconut oil is, probably 90-ish% saturated, like saturated fat, and maybe 7-8% monounsaturated fat. So, tallow, 3% linoleic acid, I told you, right? So it's probably a little bit of omega. That's omega-6. Omega-3 might be in there a little bit. Tallow, 45 to 50% saturated fat, 42 to 50% monounsaturated fat. It's almost half and half saturated and monounsaturated tallow. So that's kind of what our body fat should be, closer to that. But what has happened? So really, I mean, we think maybe of total polyunsaturated fats in our body fat tissue, if you go back 120 years or so, it was probably, it could have been anywhere from 3 to 5% polyunsaturated fats, with linoleic acid being maybe 1 or 2% of that, and a little bit of omega-3, ideally, and some other polyunsaturated fats might be mixed in there. That has changed. That has changed greatly over the last 120 years. So first study here, increase in adipose tissue linoleic acid of US adults in the last half of the century. So basically they were looking from 1959 to 2008. And they found that the body fat, the increase of linoleic acid stored in our body fat increased by 136%. That's significant. That's pretty significant in 50 years, from 9.1% in 1959, which is still higher than it would have been in, say, 1890, when it may have been 1 or 2%, but still 9.1% in 1959 to 21.5%, 21.5% in 2008. That's still 14 years ago. It's probably continued to go up since. So 20-something%, from 1% to 20-something% in 120 years. That's huge. And okay. And that comes, again, strictly from diet. Our bodies will manufacture monounsaturated and saturated fat from excess food, from excess, like you eat too many, too much pasta, whatever, more than you're going to eat. I know most of you don't, eat pasta, but you get the idea. Too many carbs, too much white rice, whatever it is you're eating, even too much fruit, if you will, too much sugar, and you convert it to fat for storage. You're going to store it as saturated fat. So we store our body fat as saturated and monounsaturated. About half, 50% of our body fat should be about monounsaturated, and then maybe a little less than that saturated, and then very small amount, single digit, should be poly, but that has changed. That was one study that was done in, was published in Advances in Nutrition, November 2015. Got another one here is published in September 2008, Journal of Lipid Research. Okay, composition of adipose tissue and marrow fat in humans by 1H-NMR at 7 Tesla. That's a very technical way of, they looked at it through a spectroscope. So don't go, I mean, most of you don't care how they looked at it. They know they found it through this very technical means. Human body, looking at bone marrow from a tibia, and then the fat composition around the calf, so from the same area, the lower leg. Human body fat was found to be approximately 50% monounsaturated, 27% saturated, and 23% polyunsaturated in this 2008 study. Now, some people who think that polyunsaturated fat is better for us than saturated fat might think that's a good thing. But again, you go back 120 years, we had a lot more saturated fat and a lot less polyunsaturated. You might shift 18 to 20% of that over to saturated, putting us closer to the 45% mark saturated, maybe 5% poly. And I'd say we were a lot better off, a lot healthier 120 years ago as a nation. So that tells you there has been a change in our bodies since these oils were introduced. It is not theoretical. They've actually, this is showing up in our stored body fat. Another study, diets could prevent many diseases. Well, that's not revolutionary, is it? Lipids, May 2003. We have there's a chart in that study showing, now it's an observational study, but it's a percentage between the amount of omega-6 PUFA and the concentration of omega-6 PUFA in our unsaturated fat in our body, in body tissue, and heart disease. So it's correlation between the presence of omega-6 PUFA, linoleic acid specifically, and heart disease. And it shows across multiple cultures, some are cultures within countries, some are countrywide cultures. US obviously ranked very high in the correlation of very high in the heart disease side, as well as the omega-6 concentrations, but the correlation, so what's called the R naught, which means the incidences which they both appeared together, or the concentrations charted well together. So if you're low in omega-6, you were lower in heart disease. If a culture was higher in omega-6 in the body fat, it was higher in heart disease. The correlation, the R naught on that, was 0.986. That's pretty high. Like 1.0 would be pretty much perfect. Pretty much like the same thing. Ideal, right? Or not ideal, but you know, they perfectly correlated. This is 0.986, just shy of 1. So there's a huge correlation between, they found a huge correlation in these, I think at least half a dozen cultures there in that chart, between the omega-6 PUFA and heart disease. Here's a study going back to June 1965, the corn oil and treatment of ischemic heart disease, from the British Medical Journal, 1965. So we've known about this for a while. And let's think about, before I mention the study, heart disease. Well, here, I'll bring this up in a second here. So it basically was 80 patients, so it's not a big trial, but they all had ischemic heart disease. They're divided into 3 groups: control group, which ate their normal diet, a group supplemented with olive oil and restricted animal fat, and a group that was supplemented with corn oil and restricted animal fat. So let's see about the control group, what they were eating. They weren't eating the way we eat now. This is 1965. This is before the food pyramid by 13 years. This is before the huge attack. There was some attack. There was some advice not to eat as much animal fat because of, you know, this started coming out in the 50s, 60s, when Ansel Keys, you know, started claiming his fame and his knowledge. But their diet was very much like, for some of you, what your grandparents grew up eating, right? For me, what my parents grew up eating. So it was eggs, bacon, lots of meat, potatoes, not probably on a whole, not a lot of processed foods. Those were coming in the late, in the early 60s. But as far as TV dinners, that kind of thing, but not on the level that we have now, right? So they were eating a pretty traditional diet. That being said, the control group eating the traditional diet. Okay, so all these people had ischemic heart disease. And 2 years later, they followed up with the group and looked at those who were free, who had not had a heart attack or had died. So they'd already had heart disease, but those who were free of heart attack or who had not died, the control group, 75% of the control group eating their normal diet had not had a heart attack or died. Olive oil group, 57%. That's quite a difference. 57% had not had a heart attack or died. Corn oil, 52%. That's a huge difference. 75, 52%. We're talking about nearly 25% difference there. That's huge. Only 52% of people with a supplemented corn oil had not had a heart attack or died, compared to a control group, just like eating how they were already eating. Obviously, corn oil was not recommended for the heart disease patients. Yep, they continue to make margarine with it, didn't they? Continue to have corn oil is very much part of our processed food that we have on the shelf, but yeah, not recommended for heart patients. Do you see any warnings about corn oil in foods in our diet, in the grocery store shelves? Do you see any warning about corn oil anywhere being not good for your heart? I haven't. Linoleic acid. This is our fatty acid we're worried about. Causes greater weight gain than saturated fat without hypothalamic inflammation in the male mouse. So it's this Journal of Nutritional Biochemistry from 2017. Basically found that linoleic acid induces obesity and insulin resistance and reduces activity levels more than saturated fat does. Supporting the hypothesis that increased linoleic acid intake may be a contributor to the obesity epidemic. You don't hear about that, do you? You don't hear anybody talking about linoleic. I mean, you do in the animal-based diet, keto diet circles, but not in the mainstream. This is the Journal of Nutritional Biochemistry. This is in PubMed. So it gets better. I got another chart here where I'll link to from Kate Shanahan, Dr. Shanahan, from her book, The Fat Burn Fix. If you haven't read it, it's very, I highly recommend it. But this shows a nice little correlation. Yes, it's a correlation, but it's a chart of from U.S. diet and health from 1909 to 2000. So basically the time period we're talking about where we had the increase in vegetable oils introduced into our system, right? Into our diet through various foods. And she includes their canola, corn, cottonseed, soy, sunflower, and safflower, right? So the big six, the primary six that we see. Obesity charts very well with vegetable oils. And the change in carbohydrate intake really not that significant. It's very almost insignificant. It actually takes a dip down in the 80s and 90s and starts peaking back up. But basically, what the real contrast is against butter and lard, which have actually decreased. We're eating less butter and lard. That's not a surprise with all the advice we've gotten. But vegetable oils has increased significantly, and obesity charts right along with it. So we're seeing a strong correlation between obesity and vegetable oils. Now this next one, effects of fatty acids on mitochondria, implications for cell death. This is one of Kate Shanahan's big arguments for us, and she actually has a chart from her book as well that demonstrates this. But basically, PUFA lowers the mitochondrial production of ATP, which is a cellular energy, to the point of inducing cell death. So we've got a study here basically showing that basically polyunsaturated fatty acids create less energy within the cell, within the mitochondria, than saturated fats and monounsaturated fats. And so, separate from that study, Kate Shanahan did include in her Fat Burn Fix book a chart which diagrams this, which shows puts mono or really saturated fat at baseline, say 100% of energy coming in. At baseline was saturated. So you basically, the energy coming in is saturated fat as the amount of energy you would receive, or your mitochondria could create ATP energy. Monounsaturated fat actually created more energy. Okay, it was at I think 105%, 106%, something like that, of baseline of saturated fat. Omega-6 was closer to 60%, 55 or 60% of the energy created from omega-6 oils as compared to saturated. Omega-3s was even lower, it's closer to 25%. energy. So you have a lower amount of energy coming from omega-6 and omega-3 compared to saturated fat. Again, omega-6 was 60% of the saturated fat, omega-3 was 25% of the saturated fat compared to saturated fat. And so this is explaining why the energy production is so low. In that study, they found that the cell would actually begin to shut down because it couldn't create enough energy from these omega-6, or really from polyunsaturated oils, because both omega-6 and omega-3 have a lower output of energy from the same amount of fat as compared to saturated or monounsaturated. So think about it. If you're putting out less ATP or less cellular energy, how do you think you're going to feel when you're eating these oils? You're going to be low energy. You're going to be lethargic. You're not going to feel like moving. You're not going to feel like doing anything. And you may, well, I don't have much energy. I don't feel like maybe I need to eat something. So what do you think? If you're eating food that gives you low energy, do you think you might, I don't know, decide that you need to eat more? So you're putting out less ATP, the same amount of fat, same amount of food. Could that cause cravings? Could that cause, I don't know, a decreased amount of energy affecting, I don't know, how your brain feels? Maybe some brain fog, some hypoglycemic symptoms. Next study here, real quick. Can linoleic acid contribute to coronary artery disease? Well, that is the question, isn't it? American Journal of Clinical Nutrition from 1993. What they found, the adipose tissue, body fat tissue, a concentration of linoleic acid was positively associated with a degree of coronary artery disease in a cross-sectional study of 226 patients undergoing coronary angiography. Linoleic acid concentration in adipose tissue is known to reflect the intake of this fatty acid. The results are therefore indicative of a positive relationship between linoleic acid intake and coronary artery disease. So basically saying, concentration of linoleic acid in your body fat positively correlates with coronary disease, and they know the concentration of linoleic acid in your body fat reflects how much you eat. So it's like, well, A is connected to B, and C is connected to B, so A must be connected to C, basically. It's that simple. The effect of linoleic-enriched and oleate-enriched diets in combination with alpha-tocopherol, the susceptibility of LDL and LDL subfractions to oxidative modification in humans. That is actually the title of the study. Woo! That's a mouthful, isn't it? Let's figure out what that means. This is an Atherosclerosis and Thrombosis, a journal of vascular biology, all right, in 1994. Basically, what that means is the more linoleic acid consumed, the more oxidized the LDL particles were found to be, as well as being smaller and denser. And large doses of vitamin E did not prevent the oxidation. Yeah, vitamin E is supposed to be an antioxidant, but it didn't seem to prevent the oxidation of these LDL particles. Basically, linoleic acid, the consumed eating linoleic acid, these PUFA omega-6s, the more you ate, the more oxidized your LDL particles were, and the more small and dense they were. Well, we know that it is oxidized LDL that forms the plaque in arteries, not healthy LDL. Healthy LDL is not, it's nice, fluffy LDL. It's healthy, it bounces on by, it goes where it needs to go. It goes to the cells that need it, right? It's the oxidized stuff that doesn't get picked up because it's been oxidized, it's been damaged. And so the more linoleic acid consumed, the more oxidized LDL particles. That means that linoleic acid presence, the higher the linoleic acid concentration, the more your LDL is going to be oxidized. And it's going to be the small, dense stuff that we know gets caught in the cracks and fissures of our arteries. So there's a direct connection between linoleic acid and plaque, arterial plaque. Next study, acrolein is a product of lipid peroxidation reaction. So lipid peroxidation is the oxidation of LDL, essentially, right? Acrolein's it's a byproduct of this peroxidation of LDL. So oxygen attacks polyunsaturated fats in the LDL, which begins the formation of oxidized LDL. So because PUFA, because polyunsaturated fats are so susceptible to oxidation, as opposed to saturated or monounsaturated, but they have room, right? They have the double bonds, they have room for oxygen to come in there and oxidize this fatty acid chain. This begins the formation of ox-LDL. So basically, you've got to have PUFA to have oxidized LDL. If you have oxidized LDL, it's because it was PUFA. We're not getting it from saturated fat. That's what this is telling us. It's from polyunsaturated fats that's forming this ox-LDL. Next one. I hope this isn't, these titles are like, they're not going to send a book off the shelves, are they? No, these are studies written by academics. So, role of dietary oxidized cholesterol and oxidized fatty acids in the development of atherosclerosis. That's the one we're down to the what we're talking about here. But this was in Molecular Nutrition and Food Research, 2005. So this stuff is, this has been out for a while, guys. We know this, but nobody's talking about it, nobody's acknowledging it. There's no changes in our food system to address this. Diet-derived oxidized fatty acids, PUFA, basically, in chylomicron remnants and oxidized cholesterol in remnants, and LDL accelerated atherosclerosis, and LDL. Okay, I'm gonna start that one over because I put my emphasis on the wrong part of the explanation here. Basically, the diet-driven oxidized fatty acids, the PUFAs, that are in the chylomicrons, and the oxidized cholesterol in LDL and the remnants, which are like the other lipoproteins. These are all lipoproteins carrying fatty acids through our body and carrying cholesterol through our body, right? So the LDL and the chylomicrons are like delivery trucks. So the diet-derived oxidized fatty acids in the delivery trucks and the oxidized cholesterol in the delivery trucks, the LDL, accelerate atherosclerosis by increasing oxidized lipid levels in circulating LDL and chylomicron remnants. Basically, yeah. In other words, the PUFA you ate and the oxidized cholesterol that becomes oxidized in your system accelerated the atherosclerosis by increasing the circulating levels of oxidized LDL. In other words, the oxidized LDL in your serum cholesterol. It's all about the oxidized LDL, which directly comes from the PUFA. Simple stuff. This is 2005. Rapeseed oil, which is basically canola oil, and sunflower oil diets enhance platelet in vitro aggregation and thromboxane production in healthy men when compared with milk, fat, or habitual diet. So these aren't healthy men. These aren't people. Some of these studies have been with people who already have disease. This is in Thrombosis and Hematosis journal. Basically, canola and sunflower oil diets increase blood clots compared to milk fat, right? We told avoid whole milk, avoid cheese, because it's, the fat is saturated, it's animal fat, it's going to be, it's bad for your heart, it's bad for, now, the canola oil and sunflower oil diets increase the blood clots compared to milk fat. Here we go. Hits keep coming. I'm not even going to read this title because it's ridiculous, ridiculously technical, but it's basically associating the insulin resistance in the visceral fat from morbidly obese patients. And well, that's what it's looking at, the fat in these morbidly obese subjects. The visceral fat from the morbidly obese patients contained a significantly higher percentage of omega-6 PUFA and a lower percentage of saturated fatty acids in their triglycerides, in the fat molecule. So triglyceride is the fat molecule. So it had more omega-6 PUFA and a lower percentage of saturated fat in their visceral fat. So there's this byproduct of omega-6 fatty acids called 4-hydroxyl nonenal protein. That's, or HNE is what it's called. You'll hear it called in a lot of books because that's hard to pronounce for most people. So circulating levels of linoleic acid and HDL cholesterol are major determinants of 4-HNE protein adducts in patients with heart failure. Basically, that means the oxidized lipids are strongly associated with low HDL, which of course is bad, cholesterol, and linoleic acid consumption in heart failure patients. So we get oxidized lipids when we see low HDL and high linoleic acid consumption. We have a lot more oxidized lipids. Oxidized being the oxidized LDL. One after the other. That was 2013, almost 10 years ago. Circulating levels of linoleic acid and HDL are major determinants of 4-HNE adducts in patients with heart failure. Yet another one saying the same thing. Basically, oh, that is saying the same thing because it's the same one. Forgive me. Yeah. Forgive me on that one. They're just, apparently I put that one in twice. Sorry about that. Role of physiological levels of 4-HNE on adipocyte biology, implications for obesity and metabolic syndrome. Basically, HNE, this byproduct of linoleic acid metabolism, so metabolizing this omega-6 fatty acid, creates oxidative stress in the fat cells, contributing to metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome being the whole cascade of obesity, insulin resistance to diabetes, heart disease. You get it. And on that note, I'll have a link in here to another chart from Dr. Shanahan, from her, this was not in her book, this is actually from her blog, in a blog post, The Hateful Eight Enemy Fats That Destroy Your Health. And it, again, another timeline correlating introduction of these vegetable oils with diabetes and prediabetes. Now, they didn't start charting or start tracking diabetes. This should tell you something. They didn't start charting diabetes and prediabetes until like 1959. So it looks like. It was first observed in the 30s on a significant level, and then they start tracking the statistics until 1959. So the tracking of the diabetes and prediabetes doesn't start until 1959. The tracking of the in this chart, the addition of the omega-6 PUFA started in 1909. But you can see as the increase correlates pretty well, the increase in vegetable oils in our diet is ramps right up there with diabetes and prediabetes. Again, butter and lard, lower. Carbs, no significant changes. Just a little wave in there. They end up in the same kind of range. Which is why I said earlier, yes, our composition of carbs has changed. How we get our carbs has changed from grains to more sugar. However, the amount we're eating doesn't seem to have changed much. What has changed dramatically, which correlates pretty well, with our disease rate is the introduction of these PUFA oils. And it's hard to deny. Next study, effects of diets enriched in linoleic acid and its peroxidation products on brain fatty acids, oxylipids, and aldehydes in mice. So basically, dietary linoleic acid increased concentration of oxidized linoleic acid in the brain, not just in the heart, not just in your arteries, right? In the brain of these mice, which is linked to neurodegeneration. So if you're worried about brain health, Alzheimer's, which we all should be, they're seeing that in mice, in the brain of mice. The increase of dietary linoleic acid led to increased concentrations of the oxidized linoleic acid in the brain. Makes sense. It's going to go everywhere. And our brain being the largest concentration of cholesterol in our body, like 20-25% of our total body's cholesterol is in our brain. It's 15% of its cholesterol makes up 15% of its brain weight. So if you're replacing your fats from saturated fat or monounsaturated linoleic acid, which is affecting our LDL or cholesterol being delivered, right? It's being oxidized, it's going to show up in your brain. That's the largest concentration of your cholesterol, for good reason. I mean, it's very needed there. But if you're contaminating your cholesterol with linoleic acid, it's going to affect everything that you use cholesterol for, starting with your brain, your heart, hormones, how about skin, how about cellular membranes, right? Everything we use cholesterol for. Strong increase in hydroxy fatty acids derived from linoleic acid in human low-density lipoproteins, human LDL, of atherosclerotic patients. Does it sound like I'm repeating the same thing over and over again? These are different. It's from 1998, Chemistry and Physics of Lipids Journal, 1998. This is not new news. So basically, high concentrations of dietary linoleic acid. So linoleic acid from the diet created oxidized LDL found in atherosclerotic patients, found in heart disease patients. Another study from 2004. It just blows me away how these have been around for so long and we don't hear about it. Never makes the news of this, right? I'll just give you the summary on this one. It's also a rat study because they have a shorter life cycle. It's easier to see how these things play out. But it's the American Journal of Physiology. Chronic caloric excess, this is the summary, chronic caloric excess of omega-6 PUFA, when coupled with acute diabetes of only 4 days, precipitated mitochondrial abnormalities, a steep drop in glutathione, altered substrate utilization, which basically means altered changes in metabolites. So whether it's fat, carb, whatever, utilization of energy, the food, and myocardial triglyceride deposition, which means, right, triglycerides or fat deposits in the heart, and increasing the risk of diabetic cardiomyopathy. So basically, you mix omega-6 with diabetes, in 4 days, they saw major changes. So this one's a little more clear-cut in its title. Changes in dietary fat intake after plasma levels of changes in dietary fat intake alter plasma levels of oxidized low-density lipoprotein and Lp(a). So basically, they had two diets. So a diet traditionally considered to be anti-atherogenic, low in saturated fat and high in polyunsaturated fat, and naturally occurring antioxidants, increased plasma levels or blood levels of circulating oxidized LDL and LP little a. If you're not familiar with LP little a, it's a marker for heart disease. If it's high, it's you're more greater, they associate with greater risk, LP little a. And oxidized LDL, absolutely. That's what our plaque is. It's oxidized LDL. Oxidized LDL is what drives is what gets mixed in with the plaques, the macrophages, for heart disease. And this is their diet, traditionally considered to be anti-atherogenic, anti-heart disease, right? This is low in saturated fat, high in polyunsaturated fat, and antioxidants, higher, more antioxidants, more vitamin E that's in their little oils. Yeah, 2004. So, great chart from Dr. Kenobi. If you're not familiar with him, there's a great podcast with him, and Paul Saladino had him on twice actually. But he created this great chart that came from his study on correlating vegetable oils with macular degeneration, and but in this one he's correlating with heart disease. So as I mentioned before, the correlation from Dr. Kate, Dr. Shanahan's charts, which correlated obesity and type 2 diabetes, again we see they started charting statistics of heart disease starting in 1900. This one starts 1900 with vegetable oils as well, and they correlate quite nicely and increasing over the last 120 years to 2020. The increase in heart disease deaths, along with the increase in vegetable oils in our diet, saturated fat really doesn't change much. It's pretty much in the same range as far as grams per capita per day. It's like a change of, it's minimal. It just kind of fluctuates back and forth. Whereas the increase in heart disease deaths, which has gone from, as I said, very rare to now, 1 in 4 people, 25% of the population dies of heart disease, and vegetable oil just tracking right along straight up. A nice steady growth of vegetable oils in our diet over the last 120 years. So I will link to that chart as well. As you can see, it's actually in, you don't have to look at the study, it's in his blog, where he has his website. He has a presentation, and that chart is in the transcribed notes from the presentation. There's a video presentation that you can look for the which I'll link to, but the transcribed version of it. In Atherosclerosis, October 2002, 20 years ago, unsaturated fatty acids and their oxidation products stimulate CD36 expression in human macrophages. What does that mean? It means these unsaturated fatty acids stimulate the expression of atherosclerosis-related genes. CD36 is a gene that's associated with atherosclerosis or heart disease, right? And the polyunsaturated fatty acids stimulate the expression of that gene. You turn the gene on, you're going to get the heart disease. 20 years ago in a heart disease journal. Cognitive dissonance from our medical community, from the health media, from our health leaders in government. What could possibly cause that? Ignoring all of this evidence. Let you theorize on that one. Lowering dietary, here's the next one. Lowering dietary linoleic acid reduces bioactive oxidized linoleic acid metabolites in humans. Oh, so here's the converse. Reducing the amount of dietary linoleic acid reduces circulating oxidized linoleic acid derivatives like oxidized LDL that have been implicated in a variety of pathological conditions, including atherosclerotic plaque and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. What a concept. So We've already heard that increasing it in the diet increases the oxidized LDL. Reducing in the diet reduces the amount of oxidized LDL. What a concept. 2012, 10 years ago. So less atherosclerosis, less fatty liver disease by reducing linoleic acid. I'd say the evidence is pretty clear. We don't need this. Whatever drove it, whether you don't believe sugar or vegetable oils drove it, I don't want to argue with you. It's not that important to me. Reduce sugar, but get rid of these oils. They're clearly linked to disease and they're completely unnecessary. We have a fantastic substitute. Saturated fat, which is very low in this linoleic acid. American Journal of Clinical Nutrition study from 1993. 30 years ago, can linoleic acid contribute to coronary artery disease? The adipose tissue, your body fat, concentration of linoleic acid was positively associated with a degree of coronary artery disease. 30 years ago. A high linoleic acid diet increases oxidative stress in vivo and affects nitric oxide metabolism in humans. This is 1998. Evidence from in vitro studies, so in your body studies, shows that increased intake, consumption of PUFA, polyunsaturated fatty acids, leads to increased oxidative stress. That's not good, which may be associated with endothelial damage, so damage of the lining of your arteries. That's endothelia, and lowers nitric oxide production. Lowering nitric oxide production would affect your blood pressure, because that's what helps you control whether your blood vessels expand, dilate, or contract, right? That also affects any kind of nitric oxide, athletic performance, sexual performance, right? So if you dilating your blood vessels, that's very important. So many people are on blood pressure meds. If they get rid of these oils, they might not need them. They might not have those symptoms. Next one, 10 years ago, 2012, dietary linoleic acid elevates endogenous 2-AG and anandamide and induces obesity. Basically, let's just skip to the end, induces obesity. It basically, what those first two mean, dietary linoleic acid increases appetite, body weight, and fat storage. That's basically what all that means, to put it simply. Okay, many of you are familiar with a guy named Chris Ramsden, who basically took a couple old studies, like one of them being the Sydney Diet Heart Study, and did a little meta-analysis on their data, right? He did on the Minnesota coronary artery study as well, but he basically, this was published in British Medical Journal in 2015. Substituting dietary linoleic acid, PUFA, in place of saturated fats increased the rates of death from all causes, coronary artery disease, and cardiovascular disease. So by putting in the linoleic acid, again, lowering the saturated fats, they increase the rates of death, all-cause death, coronary heart disease death, and cardiovascular disease death. I mean, there's more, guys. This is all, right? Because this is enough. You probably are like, I'm tired of hearing studies at this point. But they all point to the same direction. Linoleic acid is driving obesity, metabolic disease in general, but obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. Diabetes and heart disease. Yeah, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease through the formation of the plaques, through the way it affects our mitochondrial ability to create energy, which is going to affect our cravings. It's going to affect our it affects the one of them showed inflammation of the hypothalamus, the effect of the hypothalamus, which is your brain telling, your body, whether you need to eat more, whether you need to control blood sugar, put out insulin. The hypothalamus regulates all that. Your liver putting out more blood sugar. Hypothalamus tells you, hey, we don't have enough energy, put out more blood sugar. So we're seeing, excuse me, the effect of linoleic acid, the increase, as well as the fact that it's in our tissues. It's more highly concentrated in our tissues. For the last 50 years by 136%. You go back a little further, it's far more than that, right? From 1 or 2% to 22%. And that was 2008. For the average American, it's probably increased since then, since obesity and diabetes and heart disease have all increased since 2008. Well, let's just assume, since linoleic acid has been both correlated and directly linked to the oxidized LDL and to the effects of driving obesity, appetite, fat storage, that adipose tissue, or average adipose tissue concentration of linoleic acid has increased as well from 22%. It's probably much higher. But even at that, it's significant enough to create disease since 2008, right? Or up to 2008. We had enough disease to show that was significant. Between 1959 and 2008, all these diseases have increased from 9% to 21.5%. We need to avoid these oils. We need to eliminate them everywhere. So it's what your chips are fried in. It's what everything at your at a restaurant is cooked in. It's fried even on a griddle. You might be cooking your meat in it. Certainly French fries, right? Certainly sauteed veggies. They specifically say nobody uses tallow. Very few are going to use butter. So if you go to a restaurant, you're consuming these things. If you're buying something in a box, bag, or a bottle, you're consuming these things. Your olive oil salad dressings probably got soybean oil in it. You almost have to be obsessive to filter it out completely, because they're in everything. They're just such a filler. To add flavor, to add fat, to add shelf stability. They're hard to avoid. You basically have to cook everything yourself. It's not convenient. I would argue neither is heart disease, obesity, and diabetes, and the other diseases that's linked to. So I do hope you were able to make it through all those studies. I find it amazing, again, that we've had so many of these around for so long, and yet we hear so little about it. The point that Vice, the media company Vice, put out something just a couple months ago talking about the fear of seed oils being prevalent among like right-wing anti-vaxxers or something like that. I may be misquoting to some people. Basically, it was linked to the right-wing push anti-vax group because of seed oils. Obviously, they didn't do their much investigation. They just saw probably some correlation on social media, who are people really fired up about their health, who really take their health seriously, are passionate about their personal health, who also happen to maybe not want the vaccine. I don't know. I don't want to go down that road, but this is not political. This is not. Has nothing to do with any one group. These are studies that this is just a certain group of people have realized this and found this evidence. Now that, over the last several years, we have much more access to studies like this, to PubMed online. We didn't have, say, 15, 20 years ago. But there's a lot of evidence showing, going back decades, that linoleic acid is correlated or literally driving, in these controlled trials, driving disease. And it's significant in concentrations where there's already a disease in place. There's disease in place in the person. It's really hard to argue. And we can look, the thing is we can look at the oils and the fats and compare where's the most linoleic acid. Well, it's in, as Dr. Kate Shanahan calls it, the hateful eight. And there's some monounsaturated fats like olive oil and avocado oil where it's more moderate. It's in like the 11, 12, 13, 14 range, but it's not nothing compared to these polyunsaturated fats, which are much more susceptible to oxidation. And I think that's a big part. Monounsaturated fat, saturated fat, they're resistant to oxidation. And probably because of their low concentration of PUFA, of linoleic acid. Polyunsaturated fats are higher in concentration in linoleic acid, so they're much more susceptible. It's that simple. Eliminate these fats from your diet as much as possible. And that's why I said at the beginning, even more so than sugar. Well, I think once you're healthy, once you're insulin sensitive, if you're fasting insulin that's in a healthy range, 5 or lower, and you have and you're fit and you're healthy and you're the weight you want to be, and manage carb intake. That's certainly manage sugar intake. Pay attention to it. But if you're already insulin sensitive and you don't have these health risks in place, it's not going to have, sugar and carbohydrates in general are not going to have the same impact on your health as if you're already diseased, if you already have type 2 diabetes or heart disease, or you're obese, or you have a high concentration of these oils affecting your metabolism. And I think that's really the point there. Like, what is the concentration of these oils? Well, unfortunately, we can't just go down the clinic. We can't all just go down the clinic and get, a test on what the concentration of our body fat is. But we can do what we can to remove them from our diet so our body eventually burns them off and replaces it with, or back to where we need to be, with more monounsaturated and saturated fats in our adipose tissue, and down to single digit level PUFA in our body fat, and single digit levels in our diet. Because prior to the making of these oils, really the manufacturing of these oils and the manufacturing of all the foods that these oils are in, our main source for it would have been, what little was in animals, a very small percentage, and then from eating nuts maybe in the winter, and maybe basically, and those were pretty seasonal. Those were pretty seasonal there to get us through a winter time when things were not very, when food was maybe a little more scarce, right? To prevent starvation, that makes sense. If they're going to make you a little fatter, a little more insulin resistant, you're more likely to store some fat to get you through winter. They serve a purpose in that concentration, in that small amount. If you're eating nut butters all the time because you're on a keto diet and it's high fat, you may want to rethink that, because those are going to be a little higher in linoleic acid if you're eating them year round. That's not ideal. It's certainly better, but and read what better be natural nut butters. I'm assuming if you're looking at your diet that closely, you're not getting something with soybean oil mixed in with it. But look at your snacks. Look at your supposed keto snacks, your diet snacks that are higher in fat. What's the fat? Because the type of fat matters. It's not, if it's fat, it's okay. We see that clearly. The type of fat matters. It needs to be saturated or monounsaturated. And if there's anything in there, if you're I'm not trying to vilify nuts, okay, or nut fat. But if you need to reverse something because something's in place, like you need to lose weight, you need to reverse these diseases, continuing to eat foods that have a higher concentration, or have a higher concentration than, say, just your typical basic animal foods, that's probably not helping. You may want to limit your intake of those fats until you find some balance. If you're healthy and it's not affecting you negatively, fine. But again, to reverse something, you may need to take it to a level, to a more extreme level of elimination than might be your maintenance mode. But for sure, soybean oil, canola oil, safflower, sunflower, those seem to be the big ones, the most common. Corn oil seem to be the big ones. You have to avoid them like they're poison, because they are, because the concentrations of them is unnatural. And we have unnatural concentrations of them in our body fat. Even those of us who've been living this way, like myself, who have been avoiding those to some degree over the last 10 years, let's say, or even 5 years, however long you've been on a diet, avoiding processed food. If it's only been a few years, you probably have some concentration of these fats in your body fat, and you're going to have to really be diligent about moving them from your diet consistently over a long period of time, and replacing those with saturated and monosaturated fats from ideally animal-based sources, in my opinion, and sticking to a whole food diet before that fat in your body, that concentration of linoleic acid in your body fat is down to normal levels. So if there was something to be obsessive about, I'd say this is it. It seems to be driving disease across the board. So with that, again, I will leave you with links to these if you want to dig into them or use them as evidence when you're talking to people who don't understand, so that you are not the source. And that's what I hope this is for you. For those of you who already know this and understand this, maybe you get a little bit greater understanding, like I have the last couple of years, looking at some of these studies and listening to people who are a little farther down the path than I was, like Paul Saladino, Kate Shanahan, Chris Kenobi. There's a number of them who understood this better, the impact much better. This appears to be much more impactful on our health than any other single dietary influence that I can see right now. And there's a ton of evidence to back it up. So hopefully this is a resource for you to, again, not be the source. But if you're sharing this with other people, you can show study after study after study from different people, from different places, that are showing that you're not on some weird kick. You're not in a dietary cult. You are not just someone who loves meat and wants to, burn down, the system. These are all studies published in, peer-reviewed and in incredible journals over several decades. And it's being ignored. It's not being publicized, but it is published. And so hopefully this will be a resource for you to share with others. I'm not saying necessarily my podcast, but at least the studies. They want to see it and read through the summaries if they have that patience to do that. And the charts, I think, again, the correlation, which is not proof causation, but they correlate them on a timeline, which is hard to argue with. It makes you have to take a closer look, because if our saturated fat intake, what's great about the correlation with the charts, if I'm going to end with this, correlation of saturated fat did not go up. And the change in, but the disease did. The correlation with saturated fat was saturated fat pretty much stayed the same. Use of butter and lard stayed the same. Carbohydrate intake pretty much stayed the same. The only thing that really increased, the two things that increased, were the rates of disease that were metabolic disease, right? Obesity, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease. And so metabolic disease, individually broken down, right? And then vegetable oil. That's what increased in our diet, was the increase and the introduction and increase of usage of vegetable oil. There was no correlation between the disease states and saturated fat or even carbohydrate intake. Sugar, sure, yes, you could draw a correlation, I'm sure, with just sugar. But carb intake in general, no. Saturated fat, which seems to be the real villain that everyone goes after and fears, none. So if there's no correlation, why would you look deeper for causation? There needs to be some sort of correlation along a timeline of usage or introduction in the diet with the disease states. There is with vegetable oil, yet very little investigation other than these studies, but very little public investigation into causation of vegetable oil and these disease states. Plenty of investigation and vilifying saturated fat with these disease states, although there is no correlation. Why they're looking closer for a cause when there's no correlation, I don't know. It doesn't seem to make sense why you would go down that road. There is correlation with vegetable oil and the disease states. So that would warrant, that doesn't, you can say it doesn't prove anything, but it would certainly warrant a closer look. And that's what might have driven some of these studies. So we have not only correlation on a timeline, but we have these studies that show much more than correlation on a timeline. They show causation. And again, it's being ignored. It's being consciously, it has to be consciously ignored, because if I can find these, anybody can. So with that, please, I hope I leave you, do your own research, but I hope I've left you something to do that with. I've given you some resources to look at and share, because it's really hard, especially with family and friends, people have known you for a long time and have watched you maybe go through a lot of changes in your diet and lifestyle as you're seeking health. Maybe you've been a vegetarian at one point. Maybe you did a different keto, and then you've gone animal-based and carnivore, and then you're back to, you're seeking truth. You're seeking ideal diet for your health, for your long-term health, and the changes you want to make. And to them, that may look odd or flighty. So these studies might help you to not be the source, but just pointing to the sources and saying, look at these studies done by clinicians over the last, or even clinicians, but researchers over the last several decades, published in peer-reviewed journals. So that it's not you. You're not the one arguing. You're not the one who is trying to make the case through personal experience. I know I said I was going to leave it with that, but I can tell you, yeah, my cholesterol, total cholesterol and LDL, they're high. They would make a doctor go, you need a statin. I tell you. Yet I have no plaque. I mean, I ate 3 to 4 whole eggs a day for over 20 years, pretty much every day, 5 to 7 days a week. And now I probably eat a little bit less eggs, although if I eat them, I only eat primarily the yolk, maybe even raw yolk, and give the whites to somebody else. But I eat a lot more meat than I ever have, and getting anywhere from my goal being 150 to 200 grams of protein a day from primarily animal sources, fatty meat to be specific, and so 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds of meat a day. I had my arteries scanned, so I did the scan for looking the calcium score. I have 0 plaque at 51 years old. 0. After eating all those egg yolks and all this meat, 0 plaque. I mean, avoiding as much as I could these oils has, in my opinion, paid off. If I have 0 plaque and I'm eating food that I feel good on and I enjoy, and I believe is bringing me the most nutrient dense, giving me the most nutrient dense sources of food on the planet, like beef liver and egg yolks. Hey, I'm happy. I'm happy. 51 years old. I have no plaque. That's way ahead of the curve. So encourage you, look at these, use these as a source. To create less division by not being the source. And use me if you want, but you have the studies, you don't have to. Use these charts, use the experts like Kate Shanahan, Chris Kenobi, Paul Saladino if you want. It doesn't matter. They're all going the same place. They're looking at these same studies. And make the case, because there's enough here to show that whether it's a primary driver or it's just along for the ride, it's definitely these oils, this linoleic acid is definitely participating at minimum, if not driving, the disease states of metabolic disease, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and obesity. Have a great week.